Hello, this is one of my 200 talks on the history of Western art, and I've divided these talks up chronologically into sections. This is section 12 on Tudor and Stuart art, and this particular talk is on the secrets of Tudor art. So let's get started. The Tudors loved symbols, puzzles, wordplay, and to discover the secrets of Tudor art, we have to put ourselves back into the minds of the Tudor courtier. There were concepts that are alien or unknown to us today in which interpretation hinges. Some of the most important are, for example, the divine right of kings, magnificence, chivalry, and melancholia. And I'll start with what I think is one of the most puzzling, Melancholia. This particular cabinet miniature was commissioned by Henry Percy, known as the Wizard Earl. He was the 9th Earl of Northumberland. He was a well-known Elizabethan intellectual, and this was painted towards the end of the Elizabethan period in 1894 or 5. His library was the largest in England. He used a telescope to map the moon months before Galileo. He may have been the first person to observe sunspots. So what's going on here? It's unusual simply because it's not a homage to Elizabeth I, except that he is dressed in Elizabeth's colours, black and white, but more significantly, black is the colour of melancholy, and he's adopting the pose of a melancholic. Now, Melancholia was a fashion of the period, and the melancholic was associated with an untamed, wild nature and with genius. But here, he's lying in what looks like a cultivated garden. So perhaps this signifies that the melancholic genius can also be associated with rational thought and measurement and control of nature. Just to explain a bit more about the nature of melancholy, what it was, the ancient Greeks reduced personalities to 4 types. The melancholic, a despondent personality, the sanguine, cheerful, choleric, emotional, and phlegmatic, unemotional. These were in turn associated with the 4 humours or fluids of the body, which were recognized as black bile, blood, yellow bile, and phlegm, and with the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and the 4 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and the moon. The balance of humours determined your personality, so a melancholic had excess black bile and was associated with the element earth and the planet Saturn. And it was Aristotle who first linked the melancholic with genius. He wrote, "Why is it that all men who are outstanding in philosophy, poetry, or the arts are melancholic?" And the melancholic became associated with an interest in mathematics, measuring, numbering, counting, and acquiring assets. And later writers would then go further and distinguish between the melancholic genial melancholia and the melancholic genius melancholia. And it was also thought that if taken too far, this melancholia could lead to madness. So what's going on in this particular picture? It's an empresa. An empresa is a picture containing symbols and words, and the word or short phrase typically signifies some conceit or proposes some general instruction or message to everyone. And it was understood that it shouldn't be too obscure or too simple to work out. In this picture, there's a sort of inconsistency in the perspective, and the hedge walls don't really make sense. They don't join up. Now, hanging on a branch of the nearest tree, there is a pair of scales, and suspended from the scales on the left arm is a globe or cannonball, and it's balanced on the right arm by a feather. And near the word feather is the word tanti. Now, it's been suggested that the balance in the tree is a visual pun in which the word sphere, and which in French espérer, and feather penne are puns on the word espoir, hope, and affliction or pain, peine. And this pun is made by Rabelais, and it links to the motto of the Earl of Northumberland's family, Espérance en Dieu, hope in God, which was in the family emblem written around a crescent moon, which is perhaps signified by the sphere. Also note that green was seen to be the colour of hope. Now, the globe balanced by a feather also links to Archimedes' famous claim, "Give me a place to stand on and I will move the earth." What Archimedes was explaining was the principle of the lever, and it can be seen in the picture that the fulcrum point is much nearer the sphere, and so a heavier weight can be balanced by a lighter weight. Galileo had recently discovered the work of Archimedes, and in 1586 he wrote a treatise called The Little Balance. Now, coming on to the word tanti, it's difficult to interpret because in Latin it means so much, referring to a trifling amount, and in Italian, penne, feathers, are tanti in the sense of so many are needed to create any sort of weight. So it could be that tanti means worth so much, or this much I weigh. But let's move on to the figure of Northumberland on the ground. It could also be a subtle symbol linked in. The book near his head refers to the intellectual effort associated with science and mechanics. The gloves at the other end of his body and near his hand signify the manual labour of scientific experiment, and so the complete symbol signifies the balance between theory, the head, and practice, the hand, in all science. And this debate about whether science was mechanical or intellectual was much debated in the 16th century because, as Aristotle pointed out, the intellectual arts are nobler than the manual arts. There's also a political interpretation. If you look at the tree on the left, you'll notice a branch has been cut off. This could be the beheading that took place of both his uncle and great uncle, signified by the beheaded branch. And this is balanced by hope. And between the sphere and the feather, there are two trees, referring perhaps to the two generations of ancestors dishonoured by the beheading. The impraiser could therefore, in total, refer to the family's precarious balance between hope and affliction, or it could demonstrate his learning through its reference to the theorem of Archimedes. Let's move on, though. This is by Albrecht Dürer, the German Renaissance master. He crafted this intricate engraving in Nuremberg, where he lived from 1471 to his death in 1528. He was deeply engaged in humanist circles, and when he produced this in 1514, he was at the height of his career, known throughout Europe, commissioned by patrons like Emperor Maximilian I, grappling with intellectual and artistic challenges. Now, one of the versions of Melancholia, this engraving, is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met. and it shows a brooding winged figure, often interpreted as the personification of Melancholia, or a spiritual self-portrait of Dürer, or possibly both. She's surrounded by geometric tools, a magic square on the wall behind her, just above her left wing, symbols of measurement reflecting his fascination with mathematics. The central figure is resting on her hand, gazing pensively amid a compass, a polyhedron, an hourglass, suggesting creative paralysis. In the background, there's a bat-like creature with carrying the title Melancholia 1, and a distant comet evoking Saturn's influence. Dürer here his drawing is meticulous. It's cross-hatching, shading, creating this nocturnal introspective mood, which is associated with darkness and melancholia as a mark of genius. Excuse me. Now, this particular work was known in Elizabethan England, as Dürer's prints were widely circulated. They were easily reproducible, and they reached England through trade and scholarly networks. And his influence is evident if we look at Elizabethan's fascination with melancholy, which you see in the work of poets like Edmund Spenser and George Chapman, members of the so-called School of Night, who embraced inspired melancholy as a sort of spiritual state. Historically, English Renaissance was shaped by continental influences, and Dürer, who was known as the Apelles of our age, Apelles being the well-known Greek painter, was a key figure. His prints, including this one, were collected by scholars and artists and influenced English woodcuts and portraiture. The magic square I mentioned on the wall of the building behind sums to 34 in all directions, and it fascinated mathematicians like John Dee, whose occult studies aligned with Elizabethan interests in alchemy and geometry. And notice the 34 is the sum of the columns horizontally and vertically and diagonally, and in the four corners, the four squares in each of the four corners. And also notice that he's placed the date, it was produced 1514, in the bottom of the magic square, in the middle, 1514. So this work left a profound mark on Elizabethan England in terms of its intellectual striving and symbols resonating with a culture of melancholic genius. How this might have influenced the introspective and melancholic spirit of Shakespeare's Hamlet, I'll leave you to ponder. A slightly different sort of figure, not just a melancholic figure, much more here, a knight following the chivalric code. Now, that was associated with a code of conduct adopted originally by medieval knights between about 1170 and 1220, the time of Richard the Lionheart and the Third Crusade. It was a sort of synthesis of early Roman and Carolingian traditions, and it also combined a moral system that included military bravery and honour, knightly piety and courtly manners. And it was still alive in Tudor England. It was very popular, but it was dying out as fewer knights engaged in hand-to-hand combat because the battlefield was becoming dominated by the Tudor period by infantrymen and cannon. Now, Elizabeth I entered into this tradition of the chivalric code because she could use it to control her courtiers. Because the chivalric code includes the knight's duties to his lord, to God, and to women. To his lord he served with courage, valour, and fairness, and vowed to protect the weak and the poor, and be willing to give his life for another, be it a lord or a poor man in need of protection. To God, he would remain faithful and protect the innocent as the champion of good against evil, obeying God above his Lord. And to women, this was defined by the code of courtly love, which defined how he would be gentle and gracious to all women, and in particular the lady he served, and he would always obey the requests of his lady. And of course, in Elizabeth's court, the lady was Elizabeth herself. So she expected all of her courtiers to follow this chivalric code. It was all explained in ballads and books of the period that served as guides to the behaviour of gentlemen. So it was all explained in detail, and it's available still today. It wasn't the reality, you might be wondering, the reality of knightly behaviour didn't always correspond to this ideal, because outside of the Virgin Mary and some aristocratic women, women were looked down upon. So the ideal of courtly love is in a way a form of medieval Mariology. Women were in general seen as a source of evil, but the Virgin Mary was the source of good. And Elizabeth, the first role in courtly love, was therefore closely related to her as a metaphor for the Virgin Mary. Because she was divinely appointed and was God's representative on earth, she could act as a mediator to God in an analogous way to the Virgin Mary. On the 17th of November each year were the Accession Day tilts, celebrating the day Elizabeth took office, and they were sometimes called Queen's Day. And from the 1580s, they became the most important Elizabethan court festival and became, quotes, a gigantic public spectacle eclipsing every other form of court festival. It was a day of jousting. It was predominantly a theatrical event, with the knights competing to outdo each other in verse and costume to praise the Queen. Pageants were held in the Tiltyard at the Palace of Whitehall, and thousands of the public attended for a fee of £1. And just to put that in perspective, that was quite a lot, because a Shakespeare play could be seen for 1 penny. Now, the Queen's champion was Sir Henry Lee of Ditchley until 1590, the date of this work, when he handed over to this chap, George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland, which is what I've been leading up to. On the Accession Day from 1590, George Clifford would represent the Queen in battle. And you can see in his hat a favour, that is a glove attached to his hat. And he would be tilting as the Queen's champion. And this painting shows him in a costume for the Accession Day tilt at the year Sir Henry Lee retired. Notice, by the way, the topographic view in the background, the landscape, which is very unusual in Tudor paintings, and it shows the tilt yard at Whitehall, now Horse Guards Parade. He is wearing armillary spheres on his sleeve, one of the most sophisticated scientific devices at the time used for navigation, so it was a symbol of learning. And the tilt itself was a stylized event for the very rich, a bit like polo today. It was dangerous, but it wasn't a combat intended to injure or kill. Injuries were due to accidents, such as being knocked off a horse. It's true that Henry II of France did die in 1559 while tilting. That's because he left his visor open and a wooden splinter went through his eye into his brain. And just to explain about the splinter, the lances were made of very light wood that splintered easily. They were hollow. In order to avoid knocking the other person off their horse and injuring them. And the winner was the person with the most broken lances. In other words, the person who had scored the most hits. And there were scorecards still existing today. We still have a few showing the number of broken lances for each contestant. Of course, all of this was an anachronism in Elizabethan times. They didn't do, they didn't take a lance into battle. It was a time of cannons. It was a revival of medieval jousting. Now, final point is look at the shield on the tree. It's a pasteboard shield. It contains his impresa. It would have been placed in the Shield Gallery at Whitehall so that visitors could come up and look at all the shields, discuss their meaning, try and decode what the meaning was. Now, this one has the motto Hasta Quan on it, meaning when the spear, suggesting that he will use his spear or lance to defend the Queen until the image comes about. And the image shows the sun, the earth, and the moon all aligned, suggesting both a solar and a lunar eclipse occurring at the same time. And it was known that this would never occur. And so what he's saying is he will defend the Queen with his spear until the end of time. Incidentally, the smock that he's wearing is over his armour, and it would have been removed just before the joust. And he would have had a real shield that was used during the joust rather than this pasteboard shield, which was used to convey a message that would amuse the Queen. This is often misunderstood, this portrait of Captain Thomas Lee by Marcus Garretts, 1594. Thomas Lee was related to Sir Henry Lee, who I just mentioned, the Elizabeth I's champion. And Henry Lee would have helped devise the complex symbolism of this portrait. Now, Thomas Lee served in the English colonial forces fighting in Ireland. His bare legs are a fantasy. They evoke the dress of the Irish soldier, but also that of a Roman hero. But he's wearing, anachronistically, an expensive embroidered shirt. He's carrying a very expensive inlaid pistol and expensive Northern Italian Spanish-style helmet, making it clear he's a gentleman, even though his bare legs are suggesting a poor Irish soldier. He's standing in the shelter or lee of an oak, referring to his name, Thomas Lee. The landscape indicates he's in Ireland, and the armed men, a bit difficult to make out in this picture, but the armed men in the wood by the water on the right refer to his exploits at the Battle of Erne Ford the previous year. there's a Latin quote in the trees from Livy's History of Rome, which roughly translates both to act and to suffer with fortitude is a Roman's part. And Livy was referring to a Roman hero, Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who stayed true to Rome even when amongst his enemies. He entered the enemy's camp and was discovered, and in order to show that he couldn't be tortured, he thrust his hand into the fire and held it there. Now, why all of this symbolism representing Thomas Lee? What's going on here? Thomas Lee was suspected of treachery, treason, and he visited London in 1594 to refute this. And we believe his uncle, Sir Henry Lee, helped him devise the complex symbolism in order to refute it. And he got one of the leading painters of the period, Marcus Gerrits, to paint this picture to present to Elizabeth. Notice his drooping wrist. It's exposing, you can just about see it, a scar running horizontally across the base of the hand, which he obtained in Ireland. And the Latin quote links this to Scaevola. The implication is that his faithfulness to the Queen has led to his injury, like Scaevola, the Roman. However, Thomas Lee was a man described at the time as rash of speech and other unadvidedness, possessing of both good merits and evil infirmities. In the end, this picture saved his life, or the way he presented it. Elizabeth didn't, forgave him his treachery, which was basically associated with forming an alliance with one of the Irish lords without the Queen's permission. However, he came to a bad end. In the attempted coup of his patron, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, in 1601, Lee first promised Lord Burleigh he would assassinate Essex. But then, after Essex was arrested, Lee declared his devotion to Essex and went further. He suggested to some nobles at court that they should kidnap Queen Elizabeth and force her to release Essex. Well, that was too far. That and his role in the rebellion was enough to have him arrested immediately. He was tried for high treason, found guilty, executed at Tyburn by hanging, drawing and quartering. And all of that happened within 5 days of the rebellion. And in fact, it was shortly before Essex himself was beheaded. This is Hans Holbein the Younger's The Ambassadors, a complex double portrait completed in 1533. We know who the men are. One is Jean de Danville, the other is Georges de Selve. They were two diplomats posing here before an elaborate backdrop filled with musical instruments and scientific instruments, symbolic objects. This is one of the most complex pictures to decode. Books have been written about it. For example, an interesting one to read is John North's The Ambassador's Secret. The whole book is about this work. It's a masterwork of layered symbolism, and it's believed that the scientific instruments contain hidden religious references. And I find John North's theory intriguing. What he argues is that it refers to, the whole painting is referring to the date and time of Christ's crucifixion, intertwining Renaissance science with Christian eschatology, because 1533 was believed to be 1,500 years exactly after Christ's death, and the scientific instruments on the table, North argues, refer to April the 11th, 1533, which was Good Friday, and in particular to 10:30 a.m., some say 9:30 a.m. in the morning. It also, one of the scientific instruments, the torquetum, is angled to reflect Halley's comet of 1531, believed to be a signifier of the 1500-year anniversary of the crucifixion of Christ, linking cosmic events, of course, to divine timing. Notice, it's a bit hard to see in this picture, but one of the lute strings is broken, symbolizing discord, maybe reflecting Reformation tensions. The book down below is a Lutheran hymnal on the lower shelf, hinting at religious schism. There is a crucifix. If you look carefully, top left corner, you can see the crucifix half hidden, which is a subtle nod to the resurrection. And at the bottom, in the middle, there's an anamorphic skull visible only from an oblique angle. And if I show you a photograph taken from that angle, you can see what it is. It's a skull. And so this painting is also a memento mori, a remember death and the inevitability of death. So in all, it's a clever integration of symbolism using the latest scientific instruments, realism with the two portraits, and Holbein's skill in blending artistic beauty with these profound themes. It's a masterwork in symbolism, coded messages, and hidden signs. Now, in the reign of Henry VIII, most of the paintings were produced for royalty or aristocrats, but not all. Even paintings of merchants could contain hidden messages, and this is the merchant George Giza is one way of pronouncing his name. He was a member of the Hanseatic League, or Steelyard, which was, I think, best described as a German business community that was situated in a number of key ports around Europe, including London, sometimes also called the Hansa. And George Giza was a Hanseatic merchant who was born in the Polish city of Danzig, or Gdansk, which was also one of the cities that were members of the Hanseatic League. Holbein painted this at the beginning of the second period of working in England, and he was looking for patrons. So this may have been intended as a sort of virtuoso showpiece, demonstrating his skill at portraiture and his ability to depict objects and textures. It's it did attract the German merchants. The Hanseatic League were well aware of Holbein and his skill, and so I can imagine that they, when he returned to London, they quickly approached him. And this particular merchant is showing himself amongst his paraphernalia of his trade: money, pens, seals, ink pots, balances, boxes, scissors, keys, and so on. The table is covered in an expensive Turkish rug, and on it stands a vase of carnations, maybe symbolizing his betrothal, because we know that he married in 1535, a few years later. There are paradoxes. It appears, of course, super realistic, but the walls, you'll notice, aren't quite at right angles. The table has objects overhanging it, and it's not rectangular. Certain objects on the wall are not painted flat to the surface. The vase and the money tin are balanced precariously. The overlapping of the book by the note fixed to the wall by sealing wax is an optical illusion, given the bulk of the book. The balance hangs unstably on the shelf next to his inscription. Let me mark the three things that I'm looking about. The inscription says "no pleasure without regret," implying a symbolic connection with the scales. Money is evident everywhere, such as the expensive Turkish carpet. His name appears 3 times in the picture which I've marked. On the letter he's holding, it says "no pleasure, no joy without sorrow." And look at his look. It's a difficult look to interpret, but he looks disconcerted in a way, as if we shouldn't be looking at his secret personal realm, invading his privacy, in other words. And the sign at the top says, "This picture of George that you see records his features, such lively eyes, such cheeks he has, in the year of his age 34. He was 35 at the time, but the German convention was to state the number of full years completed rather than the age of the sitter. He was old for a bachelor in the Hanseatic League. He was a London-based merchant, and the keys suggest he's in control of a warehouse containing expensive goods. So he's probably a well-off merchant. The offices he worked in were in the Steel Yard, which is where for those who know London, it's where Cannon Street Stations now stands. And the Hanseatic League had offices in Cologne, Hamburg, Lübeck, Visby, Gdansk, and they made money by communicating with each other and working out where there was a surplus of goods in one place and a need in another, and they would buy cheaply where there was a surplus and then travel and sell where there was a need. It sounds like a straightforward way of making money, but in those days it was very risky travelling by ship. Ships could be delayed, goods perish, ships founder. And just a final point, I mentioned the carnation on the table. That signifies betrothal, as I said. I should also point out that in the vase there's rosemary, which stands for fidelity. And it may be that the two combined together with hyssop, which protects against the plague, were part of a message to his to-be wife, Christine Kruger, and this portrait may have been commissioned as a gift to her before they married. Now, symbolism could sometimes lead to trouble. This is Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, aged 29, painted in 1546. He was known as the Poet Earl, and Henry VIII charged him with treason on the grounds he had illegally used the arms of King Edward the Confessor as part of his own blazon, confirming he had pretensions to the throne of England. Now, Howard told the Garter King of England, the person who was responsible for determining who could use which symbols on their arms, and he told the Garter King of Arms that his ancestor Brotherton was given the right to bear the arms of Edward the Confessor. However, Howard was mistaken, as it was his Mowbray ancestors who were given the right to bear the arms of Edward the Confessor by King Richard II. In other words, it was a technicality. He did have the right to bear arms, but he thought it was a different person and a different king. So Henry VIII was told his claim was wrong, but Henry wasn't told that in fact he did have a valid claim. Henry VIII was worried Howard was too ambitious. He was concerned about the peaceful succession of his own young son Edward. So the king had Surrey, the Earl of Surrey, Henry Howard, imprisoned with his father, and he was sentenced to death on the 13th of January 1547. The date is important, and beheaded for treason on the 19th of January. His father, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, survived because Henry VIII died on the 28th of January, the day before the planned execution of his father. His father remained in prison, but later was released. The Garter King, who told Henry VIII the claim was wrong, was made a Knight of the Bath by Edward VI a month and a day later, a highly unusual honour for a herald. So it leads me to think that maybe the whole affair was arranged around a charge the king knew to be false in order to get rid of a person that he was worried would claim the throne. As I said, symbols can be extremely important and lead to trouble if misused in the Tudor period. This is a puzzle. It's in the Courtauld Institute. It's Hans Eweth, Sir John Luttrell, and it has been described as one of the most unusual and puzzling of all Tudor images. But in 1967, the historian Frances Yates came up with what I think is a compelling explanation. She argued it's an allegory for the signing of the Treaty of Boulogne in 1550, the date of the painting. And the Treaty of Boulogne brought an end to the war between England and France, and England handed Boulogne to France in exchange for 2 payments made to Edward VI. And this is indicated if you look in the sky on the left. There's a female figure holding a bag of money, but reaching into a purse for another bag of money, the 2 payments made to Edward VI. On the right, Venus is bridling a war horse and signifying that it was the end of a war. And the central female figure is Peace, holding an olive branch and touching Luttrell's arm. The treaty brought peace between England and Scotland as well. Luttrell had fought at the Battle of Pinkie Musselburgh in 1547 and defending Inchcolm Island in the Firth of Forth. He was captured and imprisoned, and the sinking ship in the background has been hit by lightning, and that might refer to these battles. And you can't read it in this reproduction, but the bracelet translated reads, "Neither swayed by love of gain, nor deterred by danger." The inscription on the rock refers to his steadfastness and courage. It reads, "More than the rock amidst the raging seas, the constant heart no danger dreads nor fears." And the dead figure floating by may refer to Luttrell's brother who died during the war. So in other words, to me, that is a compelling explanation. As I said, it has been interpreted in other ways, but let's move on. This is a painting, the Rainbow Portrait, full of symbolism, that I've discussed and talked about in the lecture I gave on images of Elizabeth I. But I just wanted to use it to explain that symbols can have more than one meaning. And I'll just talk about one of those symbols, the disembodied eyes and ears that you can see on the mantle that Elizabeth is wearing. It's been distinguished again by the art historian Francis Yates, a great interpreter of Tudor symbolism, that the eyes and ears are drawn from the female personification of fame in Cesare Ripper's Iconologia, in which Ripper describes fame as, quotes, having as many eyes as she has feathers, as many mouths and ears. And Yates goes on to point out that Virgil also described fame as a monster who for every feather on her body has as many wakeful eyes beneath, as many loud tongues and mouths, as many ears that she pricks up to listen. So it could be that the eyes, ears and mouths which are depicted over the Queen's cloak symbolise her fame, which is flying rapidly through the world, spoken of by many mouths, seen and heard by many ears and eyes. But note that in Ripper's Iconologia, there are other figures with eyes and ears over them. Here we see regions of the state on the left and gelosia, meaning jealousy or envy, on the right. And these meanings are unlikely here when you take the whole context into account. So the point that I'm making here is that interpreting symbols requires a very broad knowledge, because symbols crop up in many different places with opposing meanings. Incidentally, I should also point out an interpretation that I quite like by another historian is that the eyes and ears personify not fame, but Elizabeth's secret service that had protected her and given her political guidance, and the secret messages that they passed on guaranteed peace and national security. And the secret messages they decoded did the same. And this could only be guaranteed by an effective, all-seeing, all-hearing intelligence service. So we think of Big Brother today as being a recent invention, but the suggestion is that the eyes and ears here refer to the Big Brother of the Elizabethan society, Elizabeth's secret service. Whoops. The other form of secrecy was simpler paintings that could be hidden, miniatures, which I've also given a talk about, Elizabethan miniatures. And this is an early miniature attributed to Lucas Hornbolt. He was thought to be the only portrait miniaturist at the time who could have painted it. It's part of a series of Henry VIII. The angels in the corner are a typical Flemish decoration, suggesting the artist was Flemish. There's real gold at the top on with brown ochre paint set against red. The face is painted using an underlay of pinkish colour, known at the time as carnation ground. And all these and other attributes of the painting are very typical of Flemish painting. And I just wanted to point out that these miniatures were very popular in the 16th century because they were portable. You could easily carry them about your person, and you could carry them hidden. You could choose who saw them. So it could be a public display. If you were awarded a miniature by Elizabeth, you would display it publicly, or it could be a private object of your loved one or your secret loved one. They were often used in illicit relationships because they could be secreted about the person, and then looked at close up, held near the face. Another miniature, I'm showing you this one because when Holbein painted this in 1536, it was virtually unknown in England for anyone other than courtiers, the aristocracy, to be recorded in a portrait. Until then, portraiture had been part of a funeral tradition. And this beautiful miniature shows that almost from the time it was invented and became popular, the portrait miniature was not exclusively a court art. There's a puzzle. The puzzle here is over who the sitter is. There's coat of arms painted on a piece of vellum that's long been associated with this portrait, set into the lid, and it identifies the sitter as Mrs. Pemberton. But that's a bit of a puzzle because the only Mrs. Pemberton that appears is the wife of an obscure country gentleman in Northamptonshire, which is far from the court and far from Holbein, who practiced in London. However, recent evidence has given a more likely explanation. The sitter was Mrs. Jane Small, whose maiden name was Pemberton, and Jane was the wife of a prosperous London merchant, Nicholas Small, and he was a close neighbour of Holbein. So it looks perhaps as though they knew each other and he painted this as a commission for his friend. This is a portrait miniature called A Young Man Leaning Against a Tree Amongst Roses, possibly Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, a favourite of Elizabeth I, politically ambitious, placed under house arrest for a poor campaign in Ireland, and the one who, as I mentioned, led an abortive coup d'etat in 1601 and was executed for treason. Now, in the last years in England, Holbein had learnt to paint miniatures. And although he only painted a few miniatures late in life, he was very influential. Hilliard, the great miniature painter, wrote, Holbein's manner of limning, which was what miniature painting was called at the time, I have ever imitated and hold it for the best. The reason I give you that quote is that Holbein clearly influenced the great Hilliard. Hilliard, of course, went on to develop the flat, linear, two-dimensional style that I talk about in detail in my talk on Elizabethan miniatures, which became the hallmark of Elizabethan miniature painting. The combination, this particular painting is meant to be puzzling and obscure because it's a form of impresa. It was understood only by those with the intellect and sufficient learning to fathom the meaning. The Queen led this fashion. She was a great intellectual. She could speak 6 languages, I think it was, fluently by the time she was 11. And she surrounded herself with the most elaborate symbolism and loved to break codes. So in this case, we see the young man dressed in the colours of Elizabeth, black and white, surrounded by white roses. There's a Latin motto at the top, which translated reads, "My praised faith procures my pain." Now the roses which entwine the young man are single 5-petaled roses known to the Elizabethans as eglantine. Rose, of course, would allude to the crown, the Virgin Queen, whose blood mingled with the white rose of York, with the red rose of Lancaster. But the eglantine was more than a rose. It was celebrated as her personal flower. Sometimes Elizabeth appears in portraits with Tudor roses balanced on branches of eglantine. Now, on the accession day in 1590, there was a column erected in the tilt yard of Whitehall Palace, which was entwined by eglantine. And there were poems written about the wearing of eglantine. Wear eglantine and wreaths of roses, red and white, put on in honour of that day. So the young man here is declaring his secret passion for the Queen. The colours, as I said, were her personal colours. He's wearing them symbolically to honour her as tributes to her constancy and chastity. And the tree itself that he leans against was regarded as an emblem of steadfastness. Going further, you could see this as a reference to Pompey the Great, and the young man by inference is identifying himself with Pompey. The Elizabethan translation of Plutarch's Lives, which gave Shakespeare the source for many of his Roman plays, describes Pompey as a great military commander and a general at the age of 23, awarded 2 Roman triumphs by 25, and a popular hero. So this young courtier has military ambitions while he is sustaining this platonic affair with the Queen. Having said that, some historians like Roy Strong identify this as the only person that meets all of these attributes is Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex. And this is what Robert Devereux looks like in a painting by Marcus Gerrits in the National Portrait Gallery. Obviously a different age, but I'll leave it up to you to judge whether the painting by Nicholas Hilliard of the young man is a younger version of Robert Devereux. Coming towards the end now, this is a painting by Isaac Oliver, a pupil of Hilliard. The painting is of Edward Herbert, 1st Baron Herbert of Sherbury. The painting was actually produced, as you can see from the date, during the Stuart period, but it shows how this melancholy persisted during the Jacobean period. Edward Herbert is wearing his accession day costume and his tilt armour, and he's with his squire in the background. The casual pose, the babbling brook, the green wood, the untied laces around his collar all indicate he's a melancholic. And there are many portraits of courtiers in their tilt costumes, so they were clearly very proud of them. They cost a small fortune. And the pose could be lying, sometimes sitting, or as we've seen, standing, occurs frequently in Elizabethan portraiture. He sometimes sitters are posed with crossed arms, sometimes with a floppy hat over the eyes. Typically, scholars are shown sitting or resting with head resting on their hand, as shown here. And all of this is described in a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy, where all of these attributes are spelt out so people knew how to act and how to be portrayed. It's set out of doors because it was believed nature provides the most suitable background for spiritual contemplation. Or sometimes they were shown in an interior, but it had to be a gloomy interior. The impresa on his shield reads Magica Sympathetica, and there's a device on the shield of a heart emerging from flames with sparks arising from the heart. This symbolizes his interest in metaphysics and hints at the divine inspiration of poets and philosophers. So all of this is combined together. There's a show of valor and strength signified by the war horses, armor, helmet, lance, and the squire in the background, together with these symbols of scholarliness and intellectual excellence. So I end again with this enigmatic portrait, which you now know is a soldier who used this painting to save his life, which it did, but later, sadly, he lost his life. That brings me to the end of my talk for today. Thank you again for your time listening and your attention, and I hope you will visit me again very soon. Goodbye for now.